Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. My name is Götz Kaufmann, and I'm proud to present a new format of the Environmental Justice Institute. In response to recent events in the United States, we have decided to answer with a series of interviews with academics from around the globe. We want to discuss the decision of the current Republican-led US government to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord. Beyond moral judgment, I want to discuss with colleagues and experts impacts, consequences, and maybe reasons for this decision. My first guest was Dr. Jonathan Pickering from Canberra University, and I'm delighted to present what we have discussed in our previously recorded interview. Just have a look. Let me start just with a very simple question, like on June 1st, Donald Trump, President of the United States, has withdrawn from Paris Climate Accord. And yeah, I would be very interested to hear your reaction to this decision.
Well, President Trump gave a speech which set out his reasons for withdrawing. And what was notable about the speech was how much it echoed some of the comments that were made by former President George W. Bush in explaining why he didn't think the US should stay in the Kyoto Protocol. And what was really striking was that President Trump emphasized how the Paris Agreement was unfair to the US. So there were two reasons for that. He argued that it was unfair because of the impacts on the US economy, and also that it was unfair because it didn't place enough responsibility on other countries like China and India to take more action on climate change. Now, both of these reasons just don't stand up. First of all, in terms of the impact on the US economy, the target that the US had signed up to under the Paris Agreement, under the former President Obama, was quite modest, didn't require an enormous amount of action on the part of the US. And in any case, with global investment in renewable energies rising, there are large opportunities for the US to benefit economically from acting on climate change. So it was really in the US economic interest to stay in the Paris Agreement, to take action on climate change. And what's more, it was hardly unfair to the US in terms of what Paris required other countries to do. So unlike the Kyoto Protocol, China and India, the largest developing country emitters, had signed up to take action to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And they had made significant pledges. In fact, it looks like they're on track to exceed their current pledges. So it wasn't true at all that the agreement required China and India to do much less than the US, particularly taking into account the big differences still between those countries in terms of income per capita and emissions per capita. In China and India, they're much lower. So really, ultimately, what was much more unfair was the decision of the US to backtrack on the agreement at a time when the risks of climate change are becoming increasingly apparent, particularly for poorer countries that are highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So the decision to withdraw was, in my view, unjustified. But that still leaves open the question of whether overall for action on climate change, it was better to have the US out of the agreement than in it. So it may not seem like a promising argument at first, but there were risks of having the US remain in the agreement as an obstructive player. It could have watered down the so-called Paris Rule Book, which is currently being negotiated, which aims to implement the provisions of the Paris Agreement. And my colleague at the Australian National University, Luke Kemp, has recently written an article in Nature Climate Change arguing that the US was actually better out than in. It was better for it to be out of the agreement rather than stay inside and obstruct. And part of his argument is that, well, there are a lot of the damage that the US has done it could have done even by staying within the Paris Agreement. So even before President Trump made the decision to withdraw, the US government, the administration had already pulled apart many of the federal climate policies that former President Obama had introduced, and this meant that the US was already on track to miss the target that it had signed up to in Paris. And what's more, the US had also, under Trump, cut back significantly the funding contributions that it had pledged to the Green Climate Fund, which aims to support action on climate change in developing countries. So really a lot of the damage had been done already. And the big question now is what additional damage could withdrawing from the agreement do, or could there be a silver lining? So at this stage, it remains to be seen how countries will react. So initially, in the days after the announcement, countries like China and India, also the European Union, reaffirmed their resolve to stick with their Paris targets, and as did many US states, cities and businesses as well. So it was encouraging that many countries said that they would still stick with their commitments regardless of what the US does. But it's all and well and good to say so, but it remains to be seen whether they will actually follow through on those, on what they say. And there is also the concern that there are a number of countries that are more reluctant to take action, countries that are particularly dependent on fossil fuels, whether it's Russia, Saudi Arabia, or Australia, that are already reluctant partners in global action. And there is a concern that the US withdrawal will send a signal to those countries that it's okay to backtrack. Those countries may not pull out, but they may go slow on the targets they've signed up to. They may delay ratifying the agreement. Russia hasn't ratified yet, and it may only do so in a few years down the track. And countries may also decide to water down their future targets. So there are still a range of risks.
May I ask you one question with this regard? Some people argue that the Paris Climate Accord actually is a kind of neoliberal agreement, which allows actually, due to the NDCs, to make kind of every policy you would like. So what is your thought on the decision? Why would a president, as part of the Republican Party, as part of a very neoliberal approach to modernization and development, would withdraw from an agreement which actually does not constrain any, but gives so many chances to developed countries to develop green technologies and make a lot of profit out of it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is puzzling in many ways, considering, as you say, that so many businesses had expressed their support, including some of the big oil companies like ExxonMobil. Now, different companies may well have different interpretations of what the agreement can and can't do. So there's possibly a cynical interpretation amongst some companies that the Paris Agreement is actually so weak that it's worth supporting, because if the Paris Agreement falls over, then maybe there could be other policies or agreements that come into effect that could be more constraining on the use of fossil fuels. But I think if we're looking at the US decision, that it needs to be seen in the backdrop of, I guess, the ideological war over climate change that the Republican Party has, in recent years particularly, been strongly opposed to action on climate change. The Paris Agreement became something of a symbol, not only of climate change, which they didn't like, but also of the UN system, which many Republicans see as, as a step towards global government. And so in some ways, Paris was quite a prominent ideological target, and it may well have been that President Trump made the decision to withdraw to appease those within the Republican Party who supported that view.
And what to the same entity? What do you say about people arguing that, well, there are obviously losers in all countries of globalization, and Donald Trump was one of the few, beside Bernie Sanders, addressing those which are losers or which are not benefiting from the global development. Would you argue that his withdrawal from climate accord is kind of a contribution, or like was made in reference to his supporters, which see themselves as like the losers of globalization, as he said in his speech, like, I'm representing not Paris, I'm representing Pittsburgh.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Yes, that was an interesting comment that he made, and it was also interesting that the mayor of Pittsburgh subsequently spoke up against what Trump had said, and pointed out that his city was taking strides to reduce emissions, and that the citizens of the city were also supportive of acting on climate change. So but I think it is true that the decision to withdraw could be seen as consistent with Trump's economic nationalism. So this skepticism towards international trade agreements and so on. There is perhaps a sense that the Paris Agreement was likewise disadvantageous to the US in some way. But like many of Trump's other statements, that apparently seem to be in support of citizens of the US who've been marginalised by globalisation. The decision to withdraw is really more likely to harm those people who have perhaps been disadvantaged by loss of manufacturing jobs and the like. Trump has said that he'll help to revive the coal industry, but the coal industry is already in structural decline, and so really he's just been giving false hope to people that these industries still have a future. Instead, there are more jobs emerging in renewable industries, and really what the president could benefit disadvantaged citizens of the US far more by taking advantage of those new technologies and boosting employment in those technologies as well.
Coming to the last point of the debate, which actually is of highest concern, I think, for the academic community in the world, what is your opinion on like what we as academics can do? How should we react? What kind of action should we take to respond?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yes. Well, yeah. And the US is now the second largest emitter in the world after China, but it still has an outsized responsibility to take action on climate change. So, I think, well, first of all, climate scientists, can underscore, as Ben Sanderson and colleagues have done recently, that the US absence from global cooperation on climate change will make it very hard to meet Paris temperature goals. So the first role is to provide a factual basis. What in concrete terms does the US withdrawal mean in terms of global greenhouse gas emissions? There's also an important role for normative theorists, philosophers and others to clarify the ethical obligations that the US has to take action. So not only is it a major contributor to climate change, but it has a substantial capacity to act as well. And also it has benefited from fossil fuel development over centuries. So there are a number of reasons why it has an obligation to take more action than it already is. The other points where social scientists, academics contribute is to make provocative arguments to challenge conventional wisdoms about, well, is it actually so bad if the US withdraws, if it's not currently committed to action on climate change anyway, and if a future administration could readily rejoin the agreement after the next presidential election. So making those sort of challenging arguments is critical. And finally, it's important for academics to draw attention to the broader spectrum of actions on climate change that are happening at the moment and that could happen. So to look at, well, what contributions are states in the US, cities, businesses making? How could they do more? How could their contributions be scaled up? And what sorts of other institutional arrangements could help to consolidate action on climate change on the international level, whether it's through things like border measures on carbon-intensive goods, whether it's through other forms of international agreement among committed players. So there are a range of other ways in which global cooperation on climate change could be strengthened, and academics can play a critical role in informing those debates.
Okay, just one very, very last question.
Sure.
Have we as academics throughout the debate on climate change since basically the 70s underestimated the role of the socially disadvantaged people in the world, so that we are now facing a presidency based on the votes of people which actually have not benefited? Have we underestimated this factor by just speaking about like gathering facts to explain everyone that climate change is a big risk and not matching the main concerns of the majority of the people, at least in the United States, but we also have it in Germany and throughout the world, the populist race, because we maybe have made a mistake. What do you think?
I think each contributor to the debate has its limitations, and perhaps there's a concern that those who have called for strong action on climate change haven't necessarily addressed as explicitly as they could the social and economic implications of essentially a major transformation of societies that's required. I think that's increasingly changing now. The environmental justice community, the research community, is playing a valuable role now in looking at the question of the just transition of the workforce towards cleaner economies, and that's critical to public acceptance for action on climate change. We've seen that in Australia, that a climate policy that doesn't have arrangements to help, say, coal mining communities and others to adjust is going to be politically difficult. But in the Australian context, it hasn't been so much that the academics have been neglecting this issue, but more that many of the policymakers haven't been as willing to grapple with the issue. So yes, the academic community could do more, but there is also significant work that's taking place, and the challenge remains for academics and for policymakers to translate findings in that research into policies that help marginalised communities.
Okay, thank you very much for taking the time, Jonathan. It was great having you, and I wish you the best.
Thanks. Great. Thanks very much.